By 6:40 p.m., Paramedic Grant Sullivan was face down on his own driveway with a knee in his back and a pair of handcuffs biting into his wrists, while his 11-year-old daughter watched from the front window, screaming his name through the glass. 2 patrol officers had arrived at his house without warning, reading him his rights for violating a restraining order he had never once been served, filed by a woman he had exchanged exactly 4 unpleasant conversations with in his life, HOA President Denise Talbot. Grant didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He simply asked again and again to see the order with his name on it, and got no answer at all. Stay with Grant as one forged document unravels into a scheme that had already stolen the freedom, reputations, and peace of mind of half a dozen families before his, and that was about to collapse the moment he walked into a courtroom Denise Talbot never expected him to reach. Grant Sullivan was 39 years old, a paramedic of 14 years who had spent his career walking into other people's worst moments and staying calm enough to save them. He was raising his daughter, Mia, alone since his wife's death 3 years earlier, and the 2 of them had moved into Cedar Bluff Meadows 18 months ago specifically because the listing promised a quiet, family-friendly community. A promise that held up right until the HOA board election that spring, when Denise Talbot ran unopposed and began treating the position less like a volunteer role and more like a personal kingdom. The trouble started small, the way it always does. Grant kept his ambulance service pickup truck parked in his own driveway overnight between 24-hour shifts, and Denise decided the truck violated the community's no commercial vehicles clause, despite it being his personal vehicle that simply carried a small magnetic company logo. Grant appealed the citation in writing, attached his vehicle registration, and won. The board's own attorney sided with him. Denise did not take the loss quietly. At the next community mixer, she told several neighbors, loudly enough for Grant to hear, that some people thought the rules didn't apply to them because they wore a uniform. Over the following 2 months, Grant found himself cited for things other residents were never cited for. Trash cans left out 4 hours past the pickup window, a bird feeder deemed unsightly, a basketball hoop measured to be 6 inches over the setback line. Each time, Grant documented everything: photos, timestamps, certified mail receipts. Each time, he won the appeal. And each time, Denise Talbot's tone in board emails grew colder, until one read simply, "Some residents seem to enjoy making my job difficult. That tends to catch up with people." Denise Talbot was 52 years old, a former corporate compliance officer who had built her identity almost entirely around control of her HOA, of her image, of outcomes she felt entitled to. She had a standing relationship with a county court clerk named Phyllis Rourke, a woman she'd known for years through a shared church group, and one evening, after another board meeting where Grant had calmly and publicly corrected her misstatement of the bylaws in front of 40 residents, Denise sat in her home office and began drafting a civil harassment petition against Grant Sullivan, a petition built entirely on fabricated claims of aggressive confrontations that had never happened, dates invented, quotes invented, even a claim that Grant had followed her car home twice. A legitimate temporary restraining order requires a judge's signature and formal service to the person named in it. Grant was never served, never notified, never given a court date to contest it, because none of that had actually happened. What Denise had was a petition Phyllis had helped her draft using an old template from the clerk's office, stamped with a scanned copy of a judge's signature lifted from an unrelated, already closed case file Phyllis had access to. It was never filed through the actual court docket. It existed only as a printed document with the right letterhead and the wrong everything else, and Denise mailed a copy of it directly to the local sheriff's non-emergency liaison office, framing it as a matter of community safety, rather than routing it through any actual legal channel. A patrol sergeant named Cole Bannister, new to the district and unfamiliar with Cedar Bluff Meadows, received the order secondhand through a liaison officer who assumed, reasonably, that a document with a judge's signature on it had been properly filed. When a resident, Denise herself, called in that evening claiming Grant had shown up near her property in violation of the order, Bannister and his partner responded to Grant's house directly, treating a document neither of them had verified as grounds enough for an on-site arrest. Grant spent the night in a holding cell, replaying every interaction with Denise Talbot, unable to understand what order they were even referring to, since he had never been served with anything, never received a summons, never stood before a judge. Mia stayed with Grant's sister, Renata, who sat up all night trying to reach a lawyer, while Grant, a man used to being the calm one in every crisis, sat on a concrete bench trying not to let the fear show, because he'd learned a long time ago that panic never once made a bad situation better. Grant was released the next morning on his own recognizance, pending a hearing, and by that afternoon he had retained a defense attorney named Priscilla Okonkwo-Reyes, a sharp, no-nonsense litigator who asked Grant the exact right question within the first 5 minutes of their meeting. If this order was real, there'd be a case number. Do you have one? Grant didn't. Neither, it turned out, did the sheriff's department, because when Priscilla requested the official court docket entry for the order, the clerk's office had no record of any such filing ever existing under Grant Sullivan's name. Priscilla filed an emergency motion demanding the sheriff's department produce the original certified order used to justify the arrest. What came back 3 days later wasn't a certified order at all. It was a photocopy, missing the required court seal embossment, missing a matching case number in the county's electronic filing system, and bearing a judge's signature that, when compared against that same judge's verified signature on file, was subtly, unmistakably different. Priscilla's paralegal, a meticulous researcher named Yusuf Adeyemi, began quietly reaching out to other Cedar Bluff Meadows residents who'd had run-ins with Denise Talbot over the past 3 years. He found 4 other families who described nearly identical situations. Sudden, aggressive HOA citations, followed by an abrupt escalation to a restraining order or cease and desist, that none of them had ever actually been served through the court, followed by 2 of them being quietly pushed into selling their homes and moving away rather than fight a system that seemed rigged against them. When investigators working with the district attorney's office traced the template and the lifted signature back to the clerk's internal filing system, they brought Phyllis Rourke in for questioning. Phyllis, facing the real possibility of losing her job and her pension after 18 years with the county, broke almost immediately, telling investigators that Denise had asked for a small favor 18 months earlier, and that each subsequent request had felt harder to refuse than the one before it, until refusing no longer felt like an option at all. Denise, unaware how far the investigation had already gone, spent the weeks before the hearing telling fellow board members that Grant's case would be thrown out on a technicality, and that she fully expected him to be too embarrassed, or too broke from legal fees, to bother showing up at all. She had built her entire plan on an assumption that the people she targeted would fold quietly, the way 2 families already had. She had no idea that Priscilla Okonkwo-Reyes did not take cases she expected to lose, and that Grant Sullivan was not a man who folded under pressure. Pressure was, after all, the only thing his entire career had ever trained him to handle. The criminal case against Grant for violating the fraudulent order was formally dismissed a week before the hearing, once the DA's office confirmed no legitimate order had ever existed. But that dismissal wasn't the end of anything, it was the opening move. Priscilla filed a civil suit on Grant's behalf against Denise Talbot personally, the HOA board collectively, and Phyllis Rourke, alleging malicious prosecution, forgery, false imprisonment, defamation, and abusive process, with a hearing date set exactly 6 weeks out. Denise arrived at the courthouse that morning wearing a cream suit and the same practiced, confident smile she wore to every board meeting, having told her closest ally on the board that Grant would almost certainly settle quietly or simply not show, the way it had gone before. She was seated at the defense table reviewing notes with her attorney when the courtroom doors opened and Grant Sullivan walked in beside Priscilla Okonkwo-Reyes. Calm, composed, and very clearly not going anywhere. Denise's practiced smile faltered for exactly 1 second, a flicker most of the gallery might have missed, but her own attorney did not, because in that second, Denise Talbot understood for the first time that this case was not going to end the way she planned it. Phyllis Rourke testified first under a cooperation agreement, walking the court through exactly how the forged order had been created and mailed, the template, the lifted signature, the deliberate choice to route it around the actual court docket entirely. Then came the 4 other Cedar Bluff Meadows families, one by one, describing citations that escalated into threats, threats that escalated into paperwork, and paperwork that had cost 2 of them their homes. Denise's attorney objected repeatedly. The judge overruled him nearly every time. When Denise finally took the stand in her own defense, Priscilla walked her, calmly and methodically, through her own board emails, including the line about difficult residents and things that tend to catch up with people, and through phone records showing 17 calls between Denise and Phyllis Rourke in the 2 weeks before the fraudulent order was created. Denise's answers grew shorter, then evasive, then contradictory, until she stopped answering some questions altogether and simply looked toward her attorney, who had no further help left to offer her. The court found Denise Talbot liable on every count, and referred the matter for separate criminal prosecution on forgery and false imprisonment charges alongside Phyllis Rourke, who received a reduced sentence in exchange for her full cooperation. The civil judgment ordered payment for Grant's legal fees, lost wages during his suspension pending the criminal case, damages for false imprisonment and emotional distress, punitive damages tied directly to the pattern of prior victims, and full restitution to the two families who had sold their homes under duress, with the court noting they retained the right to pursue their own individual suits as well. When every figure was added together, the total financial judgment against Denise Talbot, Phyllis Rourke, and the HOA's insurance coverage reached $6,400,000. Denise was removed from the board immediately and permanently barred from serving on any homeowners association board in the state. Phyllis Rourke lost her position with the county and her pension along with it, later telling investigators she wished she had refused Denise's very first request rather than let one small favor become the mistake that ended her career. Cedar Bluff Meadows was placed under a court-mandated compliance review, with every future citation now required to include photographic evidence and a second board member's independent sign-off before being issued. The two families who had sold their homes under pressure received enough in restitution to make new starts elsewhere, one of them telling a local reporter that the money mattered less than finally being believed. Months later, Grant stood in his driveway with Mia, washing the same ambulance service pickup truck that had started the whole conflict, while a new, far friendlier HOA board president waved from across the street on her morning walk. Mia asked him, half joking, if he was ever scared that night in the holding cell, and Grant thought about it honestly before answering that he wasn't scared of the cell. He was scared of what would happen to people who couldn't afford a lawyer like his, people without a sister to sit up all night making calls, people who might have simply pled guilty to something that was never real just to make the nightmare stop. He told her that was the real reason he hadn't backed down, not for himself but for the two families who already had. As the sun dropped behind the rooftops of Cedar Bluff Meadows, Grant rinsed the last of the soap from the truck's hood and thought, not for the first time, that some people spend their whole lives mistaking authority for the truth, right up until the moment someone simply walks into the room and proves them wrong. And if you've ever had someone try to weaponize against you, leave a comment below. Tell me what happened. Tell me how it ended. And if you enjoyed the story, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.